Hello again, and welcome back to this reading of Clausewitz's War, where I read different sections and discuss the text to see what he's trying to achieve. So I'm gonna begin this section from chapter 2, which is on the theory of war, and I'll just read the kind of introductory paragraph into the section. It's quite interesting kind of framework to look at this through. So he says, quote, formerly the terms art of war or science of war were used to designate only the total body of knowledge and skill that was concerned with material factors, the design, production, and use of weapons, the construction of fortifications and entrenchments, the internal organization of the army, and the mechanism of its movements constituted the substance of this knowledge and skill. All contributed to the establishment of an effective fighting force. It was a case of handling material substance, unilateral activity, and was basically nothing but a gradual rise from a craft to a refined mechanical art. It was about as relevant to combat as the craft of the swordsmith to the art of fencing. It did not yet include the use of force under conditions of danger, subject to constant interaction with an adversary, nor the efforts of spirit and courage to achieve a desired end. Just from a total lay person perspective, if you go into reading this book, I suppose if you're a philosopher, you read philosophy, and you're a little bit familiar with Clausewitz, maybe you'll be less surprised. But if you give an average normie person this book and say, "Yeah, it's a book on war," they're probably going to think that he's going to spend 250 pages describing describing a material craft, right? A material mechanical skill. Just like one time, I think I bought a book on wild camping, right? It was going wild camping and how to build shelters and get food. And it was useful, practical information. Um, but it wasn't really dealing with the phenomenology of camping, or it wasn't dealing with the kind of psychology of camping, or the sort of anthropology or the history or anything like that. It was very much just a kind of here's how to make a shelter with these materials. There was this kind of book. It's really what most people expect this book to be when they read it. So it's interesting how most sort of theory of war, most sort of science of war, we could say, prior to Clausewitz, seemed to be, according to Clausewitz here, describing the material craft and not describing the more subjective, psychological and ethical um, uh, aspects to warfare. But it brings up the question, which we're gonna um, kind of go into in this part of the book more and more, which is kind of what does it mean to theorize about warfare? What does that mean? Does it mean to come up with a set of principles, a set of tactical possibilities? Does it mean the description of a material craft? Like if you bought a book on, how to do some woodwork or metalwork or something, you're going to have a kind of set of instructions, maybe with some mathematical or something kind of principles in there too. But but here Clausewitz is really going to really discuss in the next few chapters the very meaning of theorizing war itself. He's not presenting you a theory of war necessarily. He's saying on the theory of war. He's thinking about the very the very the very nature of theorizing about war itself, which for Clausewitz does always seem to be sort of half kind of practical and half more subjective, more half objective, half subjective. You know, uh, Clausewitz will say, for example, he will give you some principles of warfare to do with terrain or to do with something like this, um, something kind of more tangible. At the same time, he'll then all of a sudden discuss military genius, and he'll say that military genius surpasses all rules. There's no rules by which, like, the very definition of genius is that it doesn't play by the rules. So there's always this sort of kind of more concrete, tangible aspect, more practical, we could say. And then there's always this other side, which contains the genius, the psychology, like fear, for example, morale, motivation, the nature of the soldiers, and so on and so forth. So, okay, so I think if you've been listening to these videos since the beginning, I sort of think that Clausewitz, I don't know if he's read Plato or not, but I think he's a kind of a Platonist in a specific sense. In the sense that he tends to look at success militarily as the appropriate fusion between intellect and temperament. In Plato's terms, this is spirit and reason, nous, right? So you have thymos and nous. You have a spirit and you have the rational capacity, right? And it's the correct fusion of these two components which really makes a good leader. For example, this is again in Clausewitz. This is something which is drawn out in Plato as well. Although in Plato's terms, it's the philosophy king. It's not just for warfare, but this is a much more complicated topic. But the philosophy ruler goes through military training, and Plato's Republic is sort of a peculiar military society. It sort of is like it's a military society which is run by philosophers, basically, right? Anyway, the point is that you have the basic principle of the fusion between temperament and intellect, and I think also perhaps addressing how those two play off each other and affect each other. I think that's important too. Anyway, however you put it, that is the basic formula, and I think Clausewitz does adopt this largely. So I suppose we then need to think about the history of warfare and think in which times in history is the intellect or the temperament, is the spirit or the nous more dominant, right? And I would say, if you read Homer, for example, and he's describing Bronze Age warfare, it's very clear that the spirit is totally kind of dominant in that situation. This isn't to say that the intellect is never present, or the rational capacity is never present. I mean, if you think of Homer, you have Achilles, but you also have Odysseus, and Odysseus is crafty, he's cunning. In some sense, Homer himself wrote two different epics. One was describing people like Achilles and Hector, who were these proud warriors, and the other was describing Odysseus, who was a proud warrior, but he was also very cunning. So this is, even in Homer, you see this even in describing this kind of the world of Bronze Age warfare, you do see both elements. But anyway, we do need to think about the history of what's happening, how war is being conducted, and how which element is more dominant in different eras. I think it's clear today that especially in the past century or so, that the rational capacity has been very dominant. Anyway, so this is just a kind of bit of a framework. Maybe we can read the next few sections through. I think maybe that would be important to kind of give the listener a bit of context. So he says, true war first appears in siege warfare. Okay. He says, siege warfare gave the first glimpse of a conduct of operations of intellectual effort, but this usually revealed itself, excuse me, only in such a new techniques and approaches, trenches, counter approaches, batteries, and so forth, and marked each step by some such product. It was only the thread needed to link these material inventions, since in siege warfare, that is almost the only way in which the intellect can manifest itself. The matter usually rests. Okay, so siege warfare, he argues, was when the intellect sort of. Okay, I would personally argue that the intellect is always present, even like like little little battles between, I don't know, hunter gatherer tribes or something. I would argue that actually that the intellect is always present, because I kind of take a more, I suppose you could say, Heideggerian or a more psychoanalytical approach to thinking. The thinking isn't just here's my intellect and then what my body does is just pure mechanism or pure instinct or something, or pure, or even just pure spirit. I do think there's a blurry ground in the two. I think we are, Heidegger would say, we're sort of thinking when we're in activity, we're thinking in activity, ready at hand, all of that. So I mean, it would be interesting to see a Heideggerian sort of challenge to Clausewitz here. But nonetheless, let's just accept that there are certain moments in the history of warfare in which the intellect becomes significantly more important. If we put it that way, then we can sort of carry on acceptably with what he's saying, even if you're not a dualist, even if you're someone who questions dualism, you can still carry on with this reading pretty acceptably, and I think that's what I'm going to do now. So we don't have to take his exact rhetoric to be true. We can say we can turn it around a little bit, adapt it, and say something like when true war, but when the intellect was hit certain thresholds in which rationality became significantly more important for success. And I think siege warfare is what he's bringing up as the first moment such as that. Of course, we can bring up so many more moments in history, particularly in the modern world, in which, for example, manufacturing hypersonic weapons, missiles, or something like this, right? I mean, if anyone has seen that film about the manufacturing of atomic weapons, nuclear weapons. What was it called? I can't remember. It starred Cillian Murphy. Whatever the fuck it was called. I didn't like it very much. I thought it was a shitty film. But you see there, right? Like the military is depending on a group of nerds, a group of scientists and physicists, to build this big bomb, and then victory is kind of dependent on that. And so that's a pretty big milestone in which the intellect has become more important. Now, that's not necessarily a good thing either, I don't think. I think as soon as the intellect becomes too important in warfare, I actually think the spirit starts to suffer. Exactly what you see today, right? The spirit is suffering in many different ways. I could spend hours talking about that, but I think anyway the spirit is suffering, and one reason could be actually because we reached a certain threshold within warfare where the nerds took over. And who's taken over our society today? Well, it's not physicists necessarily, because I have respect for natural scientists and physicists. They are, they're very intelligent. It's computer nerds. It's Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg. But anyway, this is an interesting topic to think about. History of warfare, the changes in technology and tactics, and thresholds in which the intellect becomes more dominant. That there also could be thresholds in which the spirit becomes more dominant too. It's not always, we don't all have to think of this as a linear, like it's always getting more rational, always getting more rational. That's another topic for another day, but it's complicated, right? Okay, so we'll keep going. Clausewitz says, next, the subject was touched on by tactics. Later, tactics attempted to convert the structure of its component parts into a general system based on peculiar properties of its instrument. This certainly led to the battlefield, but not yet to creative intellectual activity. So he's distinguishing here between intellectual activity and creative intellectual activity. That's interesting. The result was rather armies which had been transformed by their formations and orders of battle into automatons designed to discharge their activity like pieces of clockwork set off by a mere word of command. So, all right, I'm gonna kind of paraphrase that a little bit and say that once things become more tactically more complex, such as happens with siege warfare, um, you get, I suppose you get more calculation, you get more of an emphasis on tactics, on formations, and then there can be a kind of well, you could say, like, I don't know, like an over codification of everything. Is a kind of over formulaic sort of um, way of thinking about it. Like everything's mechanical, everything works like clockwork. You just set it up and you set it up and you have everything working. It's almost like a machine. Now, of course, this ignores contingency. It ignores two things. It ignores contingency and unexpectedness, which Clausewitz is always trying to draw out. We have a plan, but it doesn't go according to plan because nothing does, particularly in warfare. I mean, I suppose it can, but it's not guaranteed to. And obviously, it ignores things like spirit, psychology, courage, morale, and all that. So basically, what he's saying is, and this is interesting. He's bringing up siege warfare because normally we would think of this happening with like machine gun fire or like air, like the Air Force, or it's kind of really technologically overcomplicated uh, weapons and tools of warfare, right? But he's saying that this kind of happens all the way back even in siege warfare. Like as soon as you have an over complexity, it's not over complexity, but as soon as you have complexity into sort of become a part of it, you do have a tendency for things to become a little bit, let's say, rigidly overcalculated and mechanistic, and then that ignores contingency and spirit and all these other things, right? Maybe that's a good way to frame it. Maybe also it's better to frame it that way because I think that we're perhaps needing to, I think, realize the aspects of spirit, courage, psychology, morale, and contingency. I think we're very bad at thinking about these things and experiencing these things today. Partly because because of the 20th century, we've gone through the technological overcomplexity of warfare, and that has meant that the rational mind is being dominant, and that has meant that you have a kind of over mechanistic, over calculation. And in fact, I was just listening. So big shout out to James Simkin, who does who does his own. He has a lot of people on that talk about warfare, technology, and these things, international relations. He had someone on recently whose name I can't remember. Let me get it for you quickly. Yeah, Dr. Ben. I'm gonna pronounce his name wrong. Dr. Ben Zweibelson or Zwiebelson. It depends if you pronounce that the German way or not. But I don't know where he's from. But he's American. But I don't know where the name is from. He pointed out in this interview that I recommend watching this interview. It's very interesting. But he pointed out that when 9/11 happened, for example, the system that was set up, the security system, sort of went into spasm because you had a contingency intrude, but that no one really expected to happen. And the 9/11 Commission blamed the lack of imagination actually on 9/11 happening. So it was like a lack of imagination was the cause of a failure in the security system, which is a really interesting framing, isn't it? Um, and I don't know what to think about that. I mean, I don't want to spend all day imagining horrible scenarios. Sounds horrible. But it's an interesting framing because I think it's contingency, basically contingency, right? The system became technologically very advanced, technologically very powerful, but it's over complex, and over complexity leads to a failure to think contingency. That's a kind of a consistent thing, perhaps throughout history, actually. Um, so yeah, so that's just something to say. Okay, next part he says the actual conduct of war occurred only incidentally and incognito. So gradually, war progressed from medieval hand-to-hand fighting toward a more orderly and complex form. Then, admittedly, the human mind was forced to give some thought to this matter, but as a rule, its reflections appear only incidentally and, so to speak, incognito in memoirs and histories. Yeah, I mean, okay, so this is maybe I'll just say that for now and then I'll comment a bit because the next few sections kind of make that a bit clearer. Okay, so he says reflections on the events of war led to the need for theory. As these reflections grew more and more numerous, and history more sophisticated, an urgent need arose for principles and rules whereby the controversies that are so normal in military history, the debate between conflicting opinions, could be brought to some sort of resolution. The maelstrom of opinions, lacking in basic principles and clear laws, clear laws around which they could be crystallized, was bound to be intellectually repugnant. So basically, what he's saying there is a class which is quite dismissive a lot of the time of people that think you could completely codify war into a kind of systematic approach, and then you can sort of, you can sort of just have your system and then just go by that. He's always emphasizing things like contingency and danger and morale and all this, right? But the history of the experience of war, its catastrophes and its failures and its tragedies, I think, do create like a moral need to kind of understand it, probably in order to either prevent it or to control it or to succeed in the face of it, within it. And this moral need can lead to things that Clausewitz is arguing are pretty stupid a lot of the time, right? So that's my reading of that. Okay, so efforts to formulate a positive theory. Efforts were therefore made to equip the conduct of war with principles, rules, or even systems. This did present a positive goal, but people failed to take adequate account of the endless complexities involved. As we've seen, the conduct of war branches out in almost all directions and has no definite limits, while any system, any model, has the finite nature of a synthesis. An irreconcilable conflict exists between this type of theory and actual practice. So this type of theory, which is too systematic, basically, fails because it always just meets reality, basically, and it's incapable of taking into account reality, and it fails. This is basically what he's saying, right? Like, this is 9/11. There's probably lots of other examples. That's less of a war example, it's more of a security failure, but it's still I think it still operates as a good example. Gap in theory and practice is too big for this kind of theory. So, I mean, this begs the questions of what kind of theory should we have then? If this theory is useless, what kind of theory should we have? It begs the question, right? This is why this section is called On the Theory of War, right? He's trying to understand that. So he kind of lists some other failures here. For example, limitations to material factors. Okay. Theorists soon found out how difficult the subject was and felt justified in evading the problem. By again directing their principles and systems only to physical matters and unilateral activity as the science concerning preparation for war. They wanted to reach a set of sure and positive conclusions, and for that reason considered only factors that could be mathematically calculated. So there's a sort of moral urgency to have a theory of war because war happens and bad things come from it, and certain countries lose, certain win. We want to know why. People die, so that creates a kind of moral need to kind of give account of what went wrong. How could that have been different? Prevention is a big factor here, of course, too. And mathematical calculation tends to be what the theorists then pick up on, because it's something they can calculate and they can control. So it's almost like they can offer something to this. It says there's a kind of political and a moral demand for an account. What can be done better next time? What happened? What went wrong? How can we prevent this? And mathematical factors which are mathematically calculable offer up a sort of let's say a sort of opportunistic set of information which could be used to, I don't know what, like trick everyone, including ourselves, into thinking that we have control when we don't, or something like this. Yeah, there's a lot of moral and psychological and political reasons for even attempting a theory of war to begin with, right? I suppose that's kind of what Clausewitz is getting at, and then he goes on and says like numerical superiority. This is really okay. So he says numerical superiority was a material factor. It was chosen from all elements that make up victory because by using combinations of time and space, it could be fitted into a mathematical system of laws. It was thought that all other factors could be ignored if they were assumed to be equal on both sides and thus cancelled one another out. Blah 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 blah. Okay. Reduce the whole. Yeah. Okay. So basically, like numerical superiority is an example of an attempt to sort of mathematically um, calculates who could win and who could lose. And this doesn't work. Obviously, this doesn't work. And I mean, it's kind of obvious this doesn't work. I mean, there's so many examples in human history of that. Not of people with more numbers losing. I mean, there's just innumerable examples of that. You don't need like it's remarkable how like enlightened rational societies will just believe bullshit. You know, it's almost like the more capacity we have for calculation, the more ways we have to fool ourselves. Even though we have access to like the history of battles, for example, like the Greeks and the Persians, and I mean, like Alexander the Great was greatly outnumbered against the Persian army when he won that big battle. When he won his, Gaugamela, I think was the big battle he won. There's just so many other examples of of like numerical superiority losing, and but then again, like it's just that you have these experts, right? It's kind of modern problem of experts, and they're always trying to give you a kind of formulaic systematic explanation for things. And I think actually COVID is a good point of reflection here. We went through COVID the same thing. Like we have an event in which there's so many different factors which are unknown. There's so many contingencies, and we're trying so hard to reduce it down to a kind of mathematically understandable event. And if we can understand certain mathematical processes, well, then we can control it. Blah 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 blah, and that never worked. So it's not just warfare here. Okay, he says supply. Another theoretical treatment sought to reduce a different material factor to a system, supply, based on the assumption that an army was organized in a certain manner. Its supply was set up as the final arbiter of the conduct of war. That approach also produced some concrete figures, but these rested on a mass of arbitrary assumptions. They were therefore not able to stand the test of practical experience. A good example of this today is like the Russia-Ukraine war. Russia's GDP is like tiny compared to all of NATO, but they were able to produce more shells, more bombs, basically, quicker than NATO could, and they have much smaller GDP. So it's like these sort of mathematical calculations of this is their GDP and their GDP, so this means that they should have a better economy and be able to do this better. I mean, this is just nonsense. It just doesn't make it just crumbles in reality, right? He gives another example of somebody who he doesn't name them. I think it's in the notes at the end of the book, but he doesn't name them here, and he says that this person attempted to condense a whole array of factors, some of which did indeed stand in intellectual relation to one another, into a single concept, that of the base. This included feeding the army, replacing its losses in men and equipment, and assuring its communications with home and its safety in retreat. Um, he started by substituting this concept for all of these individual factors, next substituting the area or extent of the base for the concept itself, and ended up by substituting this area, the angle which the fighting forces created with their baseline, okay, blah, 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 blah. And he says that this did actually come up with some interesting results and some interesting calculations, and they're helpful, but the way they are applied was basically is potentially very unhelpful. He says that it was bound to lead to one-sided conclusions, which propelled the theorist into a rather contradictory direction of believing in the superior effectiveness of enveloping positions. So it kind of gives you I guess you could say, a fake sense of superiority or a fake sense of confidence, which you can which can get you into trouble, basically. Yeah, I mean, there's, again, I would point to examples of during COVID, like, for example, look, the numbers are down, so don't worry about it. Go to a nightclub or something. The numbers are going. You know what I mean? It's kind of like almost the kind of a fetish of math. The fetish of math. We have kind of a mathematical control. We have a mathematical calculation. That means we have control. It doesn't actually mean you have control, but this is the sort of rationalist fetish that you have control. You don't. He goes through a few more examples. I don't need to read through all of them, but yeah. He's not happy with them, and he points out that they exclude genius, anything that could be reached, anything that could not be reached by the meager wisdom of such one-sided points of view was held to be beyond scientific control. It lay in the realm of genius, which rises above all rules, as I was saying earlier. So genius goes above all rules. Problems facing theory when moral factors are involved. Theory becomes infinitely more difficult as soon as it touches the realm of moral values. Architects and painters know precisely what they are about as long as they deal with material phenomena. Mechanical and optical structures are not subject to dispute. But when they come to the aesthetics of their work, when they aim at the particular effect on the mind or on the senses, the rules dissolve into nothing but vague ideas. So basically, these attempts at purely mathematical formulas overlook the moral factors, the subjective factors, right? And why can they not why can they not be ignored in war? Well, that's a good question. Let's read a little bit. Military activity is never directed against material force alone. It is always aimed simultaneously at the moral forces which give it life, and the two cannot be separated. Moral values can only be perceived by the inner eye, which differs in each person and is often different in the same person at different times. Since danger is the common element in which everything moves, in war, courage, the sense of its own strength, is the principal factor that influences judgment. It is the lens, so to speak, through which impressions pass to the brain. And yet there can be no doubt that experience will by itself provide a degree of objectivity to these impressions. Everyone knows the moral effects of an ambush or an attack in the flank or rear. Everyone rates the enemy's bravery lower once his back is turned and takes much greater risks in pursuit than while being pursued. Everyone gauges his opponent in the light of his reputed talents, his age, and his experience, and acts accordingly. Everyone tries to assess the spirit and temper of his own troops and of the enemy's. All these and similar effects in the sphere of mind and spirit have been proved by experience. They reoccur constantly and are therefore entitled to receive their due as objective factors. What indeed would become of a theory that ignored them? I suppose what he's saying there is like, the actual just experience of these situations in their sort of chaos and in their contingency are just sort of things you can't like you can't put into a system. Like, these are sort of experiential factors that are very human and deal with. I would say one of the big things, okay, jumping into kind of territory of Aristotle here, for example, and this is why classical philosophy is important, because for example, social intelligence, phronesis, practical intelligence, political intelligence. How do you deal with the lack of morale in a troop? How do you deal with the danger? How do you deal with the contingencies, the losses? Um, uh, these sorts of, I would say, social forms of intelligence, political forms of intelligence, can't really be systematically calculated. They kind of develop. They either develop through experience, or they're just there in people for like unknowable reasons, that we don't really know why. So they're completely subjective, or they're experientially earned. So this is why you can't put them on paper. Okay. Yeah. So there's other influence. He says emotional factors, the effects of danger. Um, yeah, these factors. I don't need to go through all of them because, kind of been through a lot of them already. So, I thought that was pretty useful. Kind of goes over the usual Clausewitzian tension between theory and practice, or theory and reality. But it goes through a bit of a polemic also about the kind of excessively rational mathematical attempts to understand warfare through. I think that's quite a good topic to discuss today, for various reasons. And also, I think probably the most important thing in this chapter is the sort of like question of like the historical, the history of war, and how at certain times there's sort of a need for intellect. There's a need for higher levels of tactical thinking or technological invention, and how, even though that might be necessary just within the kind of practical realities and necessities of warfare, it leads to a distortion potentially. It leads to an opportunity for an excessively tactical view of warfare, an excessively rational view of warfare, to a systematizing view of warfare. Um, which then leads to its own distortions. It doesn't necessarily lead to like the truth, but it leads to its own distortions, which put us even in at risk of more failure, more danger, and so on and so forth. Yeah.